If you've been around here for a while, you know that I made an entire Aragorn cosplay from scratch. It was one of my first videos. It was found by Jill Barup when I'd had like 10 views and reposted by her, and that really kickstarted my channel, so thank you so much to Jill for that. Since making that cosplay, I have gotten so many questions here and on Instagram about various aspects of the costume, and I have had it in mind to post some tutorials. Today I'm going to show you how to make Aragorn's leather belt, including his belt accessories. I do not know what strength is in my blood, but I swear to you, I will help you make this from start to finish. During the making of my cosplay, I watched the movies countless times, and I have a concerningly large screenshot collection, so let's look at some references of the belt. Aragorn wears the belt throughout the whole trilogy, but it's rare that you get a close look at it. It's mostly unclear glancing shots. The best look you get is when he's getting dressed for the Battle of Helm's Deep, but as you can see, it's still not enough to pick out many details. His belt is secured with a buckle, and the long loose end is looped around. It has a very long tail. He also has a leather tobacco pouch and a little pouch for his sword sharpener. There are also a few straps hanging off to secure his sword and dagger. I'm not going to deal with those straps today, but you can easily add them at a later date. Let's start with the pouch. You can see him smoking a pipe a bunch of times throughout the movies, but as far as I know, you never see him go into the pouch. In this scene, you can see him slipping his pipe into his belt, but I don't buy that he carries it that way all the time. It would fall out during fights, so I think he must carry it in his kit somewhere else. The best look at a pouch that you get is actually Merry and Pippin's pouch. Honestly, most of the time, it just looks like a wad of brown leather, so there's no need to get too precious about the details. First, protect your pattern at actual size. Trim off the edges and tape it together. Then cut out all the pieces. You can really use any thin brown leather for the pouch. Most leather stores have a scrap bin where you can buy small pieces. I used pigskin suede that I had left over from trimming my Aragorn jerkin. Lay the pattern pieces on top of the leather and trace around them with a pen. Then you can cut around them using scissors or a knife. For thin leather, scissors are usually easier. Now, if the leather is thin enough, you can usually stitch it on a regular sewing machine if you use a leather needle. That's what I did for my first pouch. This one I'm going to hand stitch it for the aesthetic. We're going to start with the belt loop. For the tie, I just cut a long strip. The width really doesn't matter that much. You're going to lay the tie on top of the belt loop. It's completely optional, but gluing your piece in place first will help keep everything aligned while you do your stitching. For small bits like this, I use double-sided tape, which I got at Tandy. I find it cleaner and easier than glue. I poked through the holes with an awl. I used wax thread and a leather needle to stitch it in place. I stitched back and forth through my holes all the way to one end and then stitched my way back to the beginning. I backstitched a bit, then I trimmed the end of my thread and melted it with a lighter. Then I repeated these steps with the top and bottom of the belt loop, taped it in place, and stitched up and down either side. If you have a punch for stitching holes, you can certainly use it. I think an awl helps with the uneven homemade look. I stitched the top and the bottom of the belt loop, then using the pattern as a guide, I folded the pouch and stitched either side. You could certainly get far more fancy with your pouch, but a simple pouch like this will read just fine, especially with some heavy weathering. I've worn Aragorn a couple of times at cons, and the pouch has been super helpful to store some things in. Next, let's do the sharpener. You can see him sharpening his sword in this scene, and here you get a decent look at it. First up, go on an adventure and find an appropriately sized stone. Officially labeled with the sharpener. My pattern has a template showing you what size stone you want. I posted on Instagram asking everyone what they thought the stone was for, and almost everyone agreed. Someone also linked me to this Weta behind the scenes video, which not only confirmed it's a sword sharpener, it also contained better references. Finding better references after you've already made the thing is the Murphy's Law of cosplay. So you know what we're aiming for. Here's the first one I made with the belt loop on the back. You want to use veg tan cowhide. I used about a 4 ounce, and the thinner you go, the easier it's going to be to make. You have to stitch through 3 layers. I laid my pattern on the cowhide, traced around it with a pencil, and then cut it out with an X-Acto knife. I soaked the top piece in water so it was wet all the way through. Lay the wet leather over the stone and start shaping. You can use a large round stylus or really anything with a rounded end like a pen to press the edges into shape. The great thing about veg tan is you can shape it when it's wet, and if you set it aside to dry, it will hold that shape. Once I had the basic shape, I trimmed off the excess. Clips of any kind would be very helpful. I used binder clips. Normally you want to be really careful that you're not going to indent the leather while it's wet, but with this, I really don't care if it's beat up. That's kind of the goal. I distributed my clips all around the edges and pressed them in nice and close to the rock to hold the shape. I set it aside to dry down for a while and then used a stylus to smooth out any bumps. Then I left my pocket to dry completely. You want to leave it at least overnight. While you're waiting for leather to dry, you can use a knife to trim the belt loops onto the back piece. Make sure you've cut it long enough to fit it over your belt. Once the pocket is completely dry, you're going to glue the layers together. Roughing the leather up, especially on the smooth side, will help give the glue more bite. If you don't have a leather rougher, then you can just use a knife. Because contact cement requires placement on both sides, I used a pen to mark out where I want my glue to go. Barge cement is typically the best for leather, but other types will work. With barge, you want to let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes before you press the pieces together. Be very careful because once it's stuck, it's stuck. Make sure to press it down hard so the pieces smudge into each other and stick really well. Then I repeated this process with the pocket piece. I pressed the pocket down firmly, then I trimmed the excess off of the edges with a knife. I used a bit of sandpaper to even out the edges and make sure all 3 layers were even. I'm not concerned about precision with this, so I went really rough. Next up is the stitching. If you want, you can just eyeball it, or you can trim out your pattern to give yourself a guide to mark your stitch holes. On the first pouch I made, I used an awl to punch through all 3 layers. That's pretty strenuous, so for this one I got lazy and just used the smallest hole punch I have. Not gonna lie, I like the first one better, but you decide. You want to punch holes against a cutting mat to make sure you don't damage your tools. If you don't have one of these, it's no big deal. You can punch against cardboard or a scrap piece of leather. I used a brown Phoebing's dye to color it with a wool dauber. I did this at the same time as the belt because they use the same dye. I made sure to get the edges in the back and any parts down in the middle that were visible. Once the dye dried completely, I used finish to seal it in. The last step was to stitch it together. I used the same method as I did for the pouch, started at one end, stitched all the way around, and then back to the beginning, using a wax thread and a leather needle as before. This is super easy to do with these big punch holes, but my first one was a lot more difficult with my awl holes. Once I got to the end, I backstitched and melted the end, and here it is all done. Last up, the belt. On either side of the belt, there are these line details, and in between there are diamonds with something inside of the diamond, but it's almost impossible to make out. It kind of looks like a circle, but a circle inside of a diamond looks like an eye to me, which seems inappropriate here. So I played around a whole bunch and settled on this. Stars seemed like a better symbol choice for the King of Gondor. My pattern is fully customizable, so it will work with any kind of buckle. You can wrap the end around and leave a long dangly tail like the costume, or a modern style with optional belt loop. So my belt is made out of a 1 3/4 inch wide strap. You can use any style of buckle you like as long as it's wide enough for your strap to fit through. My pattern covers you for a strap up to 80 inches long. You want to use at least 6-ounce thickness, preferably 8 or 10 ounce. You can purchase veg tan leather in strap form, but I'm cutting it straight from the hide. I used a metal ruler to give myself a straight edge as a starting point. Then I set my strap cutter at the required thickness. Strap cutters like this are not that expensive, and I do recommend getting one if you're getting into leather work. Just be careful to keep it tight up against your straight edge and don't let it drift. Next up, I carved the 2 line details on either side of the belt. I used a stitch groover for this because it's really easy to keep it exactly aligned with the edge, but if you don't have a stitch groover, you could also do this during the tooling stage with a swivel knife. It'll just be a little bit harder to keep it even and straight. Then I used a number 2 edge beveler to round the edges. This is optional, it just gives a nice rounded edge. Make sure to maintain a consistent angle. I beveled the top side and then the back. Next, I cut a straight edge at one end and used the buckle template to mark the center of the fold point. Most buckles are the same width all the way across, but if your bar length happens to be shorter than the width of the rest of the buckle, you may need to trim the strap down where it folds over. I've included a grid on the pattern, so just cut out as much as you need. The buckle I'm using does not require a slot, but most buckles do. Slot punches exist, but it's easy enough to punch a hole at either end and cut between them with a knife. Next, you need to figure out how long you want your strap to be. I do recommend doing this with the actual belt because the thickness of the leather does have an effect. I want to be clear about this. Over your clothes, all of those layers are going to add a lot of girth. Note where on the buckle the pin will overlap with the other side of the strap and mark out where that point hits. This will be your hole of best fit. Beyond that, you'll want to include a certain amount of tail depending what style of belt you're making. For my cosplay belt, the end extends 2 feet past the hole of best fit, and as you can see, Aragorn's is even longer than mine. For my everyday belt, I used about 8 inches past the hole. It's better to err on the side of too long. You can always trim it down later. Once you've decided how long your tail needs to be, you can use my point template to trim it down. Now that you know the total length of your strap, you can tape your belt pattern together and only include as much of it as you need. Notice that the hole template and the point template include the diamond pattern. It will look the most pretty if the diamonds and the holes line up, so just take that into account when placing your tooling pattern. Okay, now we're done all the boring math parts and we can just get into the fun artistic part. I cased my leather, which basically involves dampening it part way. You definitely don't want it to be completely soaked, but just halfway damp. I use a sponge to wipe water on, some people use a spray bottle. And then I let it sit a little bit to give it time to soak down into the leather. Next, lay your pattern on top and use it to trace out all of your diamonds. I like to use a pencil so I can keep track of what I've already traced. You could also use a stylus or anything with a rounded tip. I continued that along the entire length of the belt. Don't worry about carrying it all the way to the buckle end, you're not going to see the part that's folded over. Next, swivel knife. My swivel knife has an angled ceramic tip. Some people like a straight edge, some people use a metal edge. It doesn't matter what kind you have. If you've never used one of these before, practice on a piece of scrap to get the technique down. Next, I used a straight bevel stamp to hammer along the interior of the diamond lines. Try to keep your mallet hits even, but don't stress too much about making this super smooth because we're going to come back in with a background stamp. I repeated this process along the outer edges of the star. Yes, the edges are a little bit curved, but you can still achieve this with a flat edge beveler. Next, I used this background stamp to flatten out all of the area in between. You don't have to use this stamp specifically. You can use any background stamp, and in fact, I did use a different one for my first belt. I made sure to butt it right up against the edges and push it right down into the corners as well. At the very end, I used a stylus to smooth out any uneven areas. Particularly, I used it to push down into the points to make them look nice and clean. And I also used it around the edges of the stars to make sure they were nice and pointy as well. Once you've repeated this for the entire belt, and yes, this is going to take a while, you can take the opportunity while the belt is still a bit damp to add some weathering if you like. I went pretty light with the weathering on this belt, but for my cosplay belt, I went hard. I smacked it and hit it with every hard object within arm's reach. Try not to be too repetitive to make it look organic and accidental. Once you're happy, set your belt aside to dry entirely. Next up, I used a wool dauber to dye the belt. I typically use Fiebing's dye for belts because I find the rub off isn't quite as bad as some of the other brands that are available. I can't give you the name of the exact color because I have a mix of my own going in a jar, but they have a lot of shades of brown to choose from. I used the same dye to dye the edges and also the back side of the point. This doesn't matter as much on an everyday belt, but on a belt with a long tail, you're going to see the backside flapping around. Then I set it aside to let the dye dry completely. I typically apply neat fit oil before dyeing, but I just forgot. Leather is in fact skin, and moisturizing it will keep it supple and help prevent cracking. Afterwards, let it sit for at least a few hours so that the oil can soak down into the leather fibers and even out. Next up, I used a leather finish to seal the dye in. You can use any finish you like. There are tons of options. I like acrylic resin, and I use a paintbrush because the fibers from a wool dauber tend to get caught in the finish. Depending what finish you're using, you may need to do a couple coats. Now, edge slicking is something I have absolutely no patience for. Some people slick their edges to a shine. I do the absolute bare minimum. Recently, I've been slicking after every coat of finish, and I find the finish helps to slick the fibers down. Next, I stitched my belt loop. I wrapped it around 2 layers of the belt to check the length. Don't make it too snug or it'll be hard to feed the tip of your belt into. Once I had the length figured out, I used an awl to punch a few holes at either end and stitched it together. Next, I used a hole punch to punch the buckle holes. You want the center to be at your hole of best fit, and make sure to punch holes that are large enough to fit your buckle arm into. This is going to be dependent on the size of your buckle. For really precise placement, I like to punch out holes in the pattern and then use the punch itself to mark the location. This ensures it's not drifting from side to side. Then I punched out all the holes. Now to attach your buckle, you could skip the stitching entirely and use either rivets or glue. I used my buckle template to mark out the location of the stitch holes. Because I'm using a belt loop, I have to skip a few holes in the middle so that it has a place to sit. I poked through the pattern with my awl to mark all of the holes. Then I went over them all again to press them all the way through. Then fold the belt through the buckle. Don't forget the belt loop if you're using one. I used the same thread and stitching method, stitching back and forth in one direction, returning to the beginning, adding a back stitch, and then melting the end. I repeated this for all 4 sections of stitching. If you're not including the belt loop, you'll have 2 long stretches rather than 4 short ones. I of course wanted an Aragorn inspired buckle, so using details from his necklace and cuffs, I came up with this design. This isn't part of this tutorial, but I do have the pattern in my shop if you want to make one. Next up, I used antique paste to highlight, or rather low light, the carvings. This is totally optional, and I decided not to do it on my everyday belt, and instead applied antique paste to my cosplay belt because I hadn't done that previously. Because it fills in all of the scratches and indents, it helps with the grimy, weathered look. I used Fiebing's antique paste in black. You rub the paste down into all of the cracks and then wipe the excess off of the surface with a flat paper towel. Here's a close-up showing before and after antique so you can see the difference. You want to seal with finish afterwards. The sword sharpener and tobacco pouch can now be slid over the end of your belt, and we're done. I summon you to fulfill your oath and make a belt of your own. I make lots of nerdy things on my channel, so follow for more.